Story 1. I had a roommate who was the absolute embodiment of entitlement. For months she never paid rent on time, conveniently forgot to split utilities, and constantly took food from my groceries without asking. The breaking point? She threw a party in our apartment without telling me, trashed the place, and then left for the weekend while I was stuck cleaning it up. I decided I was done. I gave her a week's notice, packed up all my things, and moved out. A few days later, I got a call from the police. She had reported me for stealing her furniture. Confused, I explained to the officer that everything in that apartment was mine. I had receipts for every single piece. The officer asked me to email over proof, which I gladly did. It turns out she not only lied to the cops but also tried to sell some of my leftover kitchen items online, thinking I wouldn't notice. When confronted, she claimed I owed it to her for ruining her living situation. The officer laughed when I showed him our texts, where she admitted she hadn't paid rent in months. She ended up with a warning for filing a false report, and I blocked her on everything. Edit. I later found out she moved in with another friend and pulled the same stunt. Some people just never learn. Story 2. At work, there was this one co-worker who always acted like she was the victim of everything. Got passed over for a promotion? They just don't like strong women. Missed a deadline? No one ever supports me. She even once cried in a meeting because the coffee machine was out of her favorite creamer. One day, we had a big team project and everyone was pulling late nights except her. She claimed she had chronic migraines and left every day at 3 p.m. Fine, whatever, we covered for her. But on the day of the final presentation, she showed up late and claimed she had done all the work. Our manager raised an eyebrow, but let it slide. Then came the client Q&A. She couldn't answer a single question about her work. The best part? She accidentally opened the folder during the presentation that had memes saved to her desktop, time-stamped with dates she was supposedly sick at home. She started crying right there, saying we were out to get her, and that she was being unfairly judged. Our manager calmly said, "You're right. You're being judged on your work, or lack of it." She was demoted the next week. Story 3. My neighbor has a dog that barks non-stop. I love animals, but this was ridiculous. It would start at 6 a.m. and go until midnight some days. I approached her about it politely, and she broke down in tears, saying, "You just don't understand how hard it is being a single mom." I felt bad, so I let it go for a while. Then one day, the barking got so bad it woke up my toddler from his nap. I confronted her again, and this time she screamed at me, saying I was ruining her peace by even complaining. She called me heartless, told other neighbors I hated dogs, and even posted about me in the neighborhood Facebook group. But here's where karma stepped in. Another neighbor, who happens to work for animal control, got fed up with the noise and reported her. Turns out her dog wasn't vaccinated or licensed. She was fined heavily and had to rehome the dog. And guess what? She started telling everyone I had called animal control on her, trying to play the victim. I didn't, but I didn't bother correcting her either. Story 4. My cousin was the drama queen of the family. Every holiday she'd show up late, tell some tragic story about her life, and somehow make the whole event about her. Last Thanksgiving, she really outdid herself. She walked in an hour late with a sling on her arm, saying she was in a horrible car accident and almost died. Naturally, everyone was concerned, asking if she was okay and if the driver had been arrested. She milked it for all it was worth. Tears, dramatic sighs, the whole thing. But when I offered to drive her home later, she said, "Oh, I'll just drive myself." I raised an eyebrow and asked, "With your arm in a sling?" She hesitated for a second and then admitted, "Well, it's not that bad." I ended up Googling her name with car accident and found nothing. Finally, she confessed. She tripped over her cat, slightly bruised her arm, and decided to exaggerate because she wanted attention. The family hasn't looked at her the same since. Story 5. I worked retail for a few years, and let me tell you, the customers who just want to speak to the manager are the worst. One day, this woman came in demanding a refund for a toaster she claimed never worked. She didn't have a receipt but swore she had bought it last week. I scanned the barcode on the box and told her, "Ma'am, this model hasn't been sold here in over 3 years. She started yelling, saying I was accusing her of lying, and demanded the manager. My manager, who had seen everything on the cameras, came over and said, "Ma'am, we can't process a return without proof of purchase, especially for an item we haven't stocked in years." She stormed out, screaming about horrible customer service. 2 hours later, she came back with a receipt from a completely different store. When we pointed it out, she gasped dramatically and said, "Well, they wouldn't help me, so I thought you could." We politely asked her to leave, and she left a 1-star Yelp review, claiming we had sold her a defective toaster and refused to take it back. The kicker? She misspelled our store's name in the review. Classic. Story 6. There was this guy in my college class who always had an excuse for everything. Didn't do the homework? My laptop crashed. Missed class? I had a family emergency. Late to a group meeting? Traffic was insane. We all just rolled our eyes and did the work ourselves. Then came the final project, a huge percentage of our grade, and he promised he'd step up. Spoiler, he didn't. The night before the presentation, he sent an email claiming he had food poisoning and couldn't help. Annoyed but unsurprised, we went ahead without him. During the presentation, our professor asked why his name was on the slides if he wasn't there. We tried to be polite, but someone in the group finally said, "Honestly, he didn't contribute at all." Imagine our shock when he walked into class the next week with a bandage on his arm and a wild story about how he was in the ER because he got food poisoning and sprained his wrist. The professor didn't buy it, especially after seeing him post photos at a party that same night. He failed the project, and the rest of us got A's. Justice served. Story 7. My sister-in-law loves to act like the perfect mom, but let me tell you, the reality doesn't match the Instagram posts. Last Christmas, she insisted on hosting dinner to give mom a break. We showed up to find nothing prepared. No turkey, no sides, not even drinks. She was in the kitchen, trying her best, with a raw turkey in the sink, and told us to just be patient. 4 hours later, the food still wasn't ready, and we were all starving. My mom finally stepped in and whipped up some pasta to save the day. Instead of being grateful, my sister-in-law burst into tears, claiming we were ruining her moment and that she was just too overwhelmed because she wanted everything to be perfect. The kicker? She later posted on Instagram, "So proud of myself for hosting my first family Christmas dinner. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. #supermom." She cropped out the pasta mom made and used a photo of the turkey, which she ended up burning. Story 8. At my old job, there was a guy who loved to take credit for everyone else's work. He'd hover around during brainstorming sessions, steal ideas, and then present them to management as his own. Everyone knew it, but he was so slick about it, it was hard to prove. One day, he took things too far. During a meeting, he presented a proposal that our intern had spent weeks working on. He even had the nerve to change the title and slap his name on it. The intern looked devastated, but didn't say anything. After the meeting, I pulled the intern aside and encouraged him to speak up. At the next meeting, the intern brought his original notes and emails, showing all the work he had done. Management was furious. Not only did the intern get full credit, but the guy was demoted to a lower position and lost access to the team projects. The best part? The intern ended up getting a full-time position after graduation. Sometimes, good guys do win. Story 9. In high school, there was this girl in our friend group who always managed to make everything about her. Got a good grade? Well, I would have done better if I wasn't so stressed. Someone got a new phone? Must be nice to have rich parents. Then one day, she showed up at school wearing a neck brace. She claimed she had been in a terrible car accident and couldn't even turn her head. Everyone felt bad for her and gave her all kinds of attention, carrying her books, helping her in class, the works. The truth came out during gym class a week later. She forgot she was supposed to be injured and whipped her head around when someone called her name. The coach noticed and asked if she was feeling better. She stammered something about having a good day. But by lunch, everyone knew the truth. She tried to spin it, saying she felt pressured to exaggerate because no one cared about her struggles. After that, the group slowly drifted away from her. Story 10. My boss loved to play the victim. Every time upper management questioned her decisions, she'd cry about how overworked and underappreciated she was. Meanwhile, she'd delegate all her responsibilities to us and spend hours shopping online in her office. One day, we had a huge project due, and she told us to figure it out because she had a personal emergency. It turns out her emergency was a spa day. She accidentally posted photos on her social media. When the project didn't meet expectations, she blamed the team in front of the director, saying we were uncooperative and didn't communicate well. Fed up, one of my co-workers pulled out a printed email chain showing that we had asked her for guidance multiple times, and she never responded. The director turned to her and said, "If your team isn't performing, that reflects on your leadership." She got a formal warning, and we got a new supervisor a month later. It was the most satisfying meeting of my life. Story 11. My aunt is notorious for always trying to outdo everyone. Got a promotion? She suddenly has a major career opportunity she can't talk about yet. Bought a house? She's thinking of building a custom mansion. It's exhausting. Last summer, my cousin announced she was pregnant, and the whole family was thrilled. Of course, my aunt couldn't let her have her moment. At the next family dinner, she dramatically announced that she was pregnant too. Everyone went silent. She's in her mid-50s, and no one had heard anything about this before. She spent weeks talking about baby names, looking at strollers, and planning her gender reveal party. My cousin, meanwhile, quietly prepared for her actual baby. Then, during a family gathering, someone asked my aunt how far along she was. She stuttered and said, "Oh, it's still really early. Like, first trimester." That's when my cousin called her out saying, "Didn't you say that 2 months ago?" My aunt tried to spin some story about a rare condition that made her pregnancy harder to track, but no one bought it. She eventually admitted she made it up because she didn't want to feel left out. The family hasn't let her live it down since. Story 12. There's this guy in my gym who always acts like the rules don't apply to him. He uses multiple machines at once, leaves weights everywhere, and blasts his music without headphones. One day, he got into an argument with another guy for stealing a machine, even though he'd been gone for 10 minutes. The gym manager stepped in and asked him to follow the rules, which of course made him play the victim. "I'm being targeted because I'm dedicated," he yelled. The manager calmly pointed to the sign that said, "No saving machines," and told him this was his final warning. A week later, he was back to his old tricks. This time, someone took a video of him hogging 3 machines while arguing with another member. The video went viral in our local gym community, and the manager had no choice but to ban him. The best part? He tried to start a petition online to get reinstated, claiming he was the victim of cancel culture. No one signed it. Story 13. In my first apartment, I had a neighbor who loved to party. That would have been fine if he kept it under control, but his music was so loud it shook my walls. Complaints to the landlord didn't help, so I decided to confront him myself. He opened the door, clearly drunk, and said, "Why are you even here? You don't own this place." I explained that his parties were keeping me up, and he just laughed, saying, "Learn to have some fun." The next weekend, I called the cops when his party got out of hand again. He was furious, screaming that I was ruining his life because he got a noise violation. A few weeks later, he was evicted after multiple warnings. Here's the kicker. He left a note on my door saying, "I hope you're happy ruining someone's dreams." I kept the note as a reminder that some people will never take accountability. Story 14. At my old office, we had a team member who would always forget to finish her tasks, but somehow find time to gossip with the boss. If anything went wrong, she'd immediately pin the blame on someone else, and for the longest time, the boss believed her. Then, we got a new project manager who wasn't having it. He started tracking all of our assignments through a shared spreadsheet, so everyone's contributions were visible. Within a month, it was clear she wasn't doing her share. When confronted, she burst into tears, saying, "I'm just so overwhelmed." The project manager calmly pointed out that she hadn't marked anything as complete in weeks, even though she'd signed off on everything as in progress. The final straw came when she tried to accuse someone else of sabotaging her work. The manager had already backed up the files, proving she hadn't even opened them. She resigned the next day, claiming she was tired of the toxic environment. Edit. A few months later, she reached out to a former co-worker, asking for a reference. Let's just say no one was eager to help. Story 15. My cousin had a habit of borrowing money and never paying it back. She always had a sob story. Her car broke down, her rent was late, or she had an unexpected medical bill. The family felt bad and would help her out, but it started adding up. One day, she asked me for $500, saying it was life or death. I told her I couldn't lend her that much, but could help with $50. She flipped out, calling me selfish and accusing me of not caring about family. That's when I decided to dig a little deeper. I found her public Venmo transactions, where she'd been sending money to friends with captions like, Vegas Fund and new nails. I screenshotted everything and showed it to the family. Needless to say, the loan stopped after that. She tried to defend herself, saying, You don't understand how hard it is to live paycheck to paycheck. Someone pointed out that maybe she'd have more money if she didn't blow it on vacations and manicures. She hasn't spoken to most of us since, but honestly, it's been pretty peaceful. Shanamranta 16. I used to live next to a couple who constantly fought, but somehow always found a way to involve the neighbors. One time, the guy knocked on my door at midnight, asking if I'd seen his girlfriend run off with another man. I hadn't, but even if I had, I wasn't about to get in the middle of their drama. The next day, she came to my door in tears, accusing me of siding with him because I didn't help her escape. Escape from what? I was beyond confused. It got worse when they started shouting about it in the hallway, and another neighbor called the cops. When the officers arrived, she immediately played the victim, claiming he was abusive. The guy, visibly stunned, pulled out his phone and showed the officers video footage of her throwing his clothes off the balcony and screaming that she wished he'd leave. The officers left with a warning for both of them, but the girlfriend was furious. She tried to convince the entire building that we were all conspiring against her. Eventually, they moved out, and the building finally felt peaceful again. Story 17. At work, there was a guy who loved to delegate his tasks to everyone else while pretending he was the busiest person alive. If you didn't help him, he'd loudly complain about how no one here is a team player. One day, he handed me a task that was clearly his responsibility, saying, I'm too swamped to handle this. I had enough of his nonsense and said, If you're too swamped, maybe you should let the manager know. He panicked and said, No, I've got it. Turns out, he was using his busy reputation as a way to avoid scrutiny. Someone finally tipped off the boss, who decided to monitor his workload more closely. When the truth came out, that he was doing barely any work, he played the victim, claiming he was burned out and needed more support. The boss gave him a performance improvement plan instead. He quit a week later, citing a toxic work environment. Story 18. My cousin is a serial exaggerator, especially when it comes to his health. Stubbed his toe. It's probably broken. Got a cold? Might be pneumonia. The family usually just humors him, but one incident took it too far. At a family barbecue, he showed up with crutches, saying he'd sprained his ankle. We all felt bad for him until he started running around during a game of tag with the kids. Someone asked, What happened to your ankle? He froze and then said, Oh, it's a miracle. I think it healed faster than expected. No one believed him, but the final straw came when he tried to use the injury to get out of helping clean up. My aunt, who's usually very patient, snapped and said, If your ankle's too hurt to clean, it's too hurt to run around. He left early, claiming he was too embarrassed to stay. Edit. A week later, he posted a photo of himself hiking with the caption, The ankle is finally better, but the trauma remains. The comments were full of eye-roll emojis from the family. Story 19. There's a woman in my neighborhood who is infamous for always playing the victim. If her lawn isn't perfect, it's because the city never fixes anything. If her packages go missing, it's because the delivery guy hates her. One day, she accused my kid of breaking her garden gnome. My son was at school at the time, but she insisted she had seen him do it. I calmly pointed out the timestamp on her doorbell camera, which clearly showed her dog knocking it over. She refused to apologize and instead claimed, "Well, maybe your kid did something else I didn't see." From that point on, every minor inconvenience in her life was somehow my family's fault. When I stopped responding to her complaints, she left passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox. Eventually, I reported her to the HOA for harassment, and they fined her for the notes. She moved out a few months later, saying the neighborhood was too hostile for her. Story 20. In college, I had a professor who played favorites like it was a sport. One student in particular could do no wrong, even when her work was clearly subpar. She'd miss deadlines, give half-baked presentations, and still get glowing feedback. The rest of us started keeping notes on how often she got away with things. The breaking point came during a group project when she didn't show up for any of the meetings. We submitted the project without her input, and when she got the same grade as the rest of us, we brought it up with the professor. The professor brushed us off, saying, "Group work is about collaboration, not blame." Frustrated, we took our concerns to the department head, who reviewed the grading and the attendance records. The golden student had a pattern of skipping assignments and relying on others to carry her. She tried to defend herself, saying, "I just work differently than others." The department head wasn't buying it. She was required to redo several assignments on her own to keep her grade. The professor was given a warning, but you could tell he wasn't happy about it. Sometimes, justice feels bittersweet. Story 21. In my freshman year of college, I had a roommate who was always the victim. At least according to her. Didn't clean up her side of the room? I'm just so stressed with classes. Ate all my snacks without asking. I thought we were sharing because we're friends. The worst was when she accused me of stealing her laptop. One evening, I came back to our dorm to find her in tears, saying her laptop was gone and she knew I must have taken it because I was acting weird lately. I was completely shocked. I hadn't even touched her stuff. Then, after about an hour of her dramatic meltdown, she found the laptop in her laundry basket. No apology, no acknowledgement of her ridiculous accusation. Instead, she turned it around and said, "Well, maybe if you were more supportive, I wouldn't lose things like this." By the end of the semester, she had accused nearly everyone on the floor of something, stealing, gossiping, or ruining her vibe. No one was sad to see her move out. Story 22. At my previous job, there was a guy who loved to pull the victim card whenever he got caught slacking off. Missed deadlines? I'm dealing with so much at home. Messed up a major report? The team didn't give me enough input. One day, he submitted a report full of errors. Numbers didn't add up, and key information was missing. When our manager asked him about it, he claimed he had been overloaded with other tasks. The thing is, we all used a shared task tracker, and his list was half as long as everyone else's. Our manager gave him a chance to explain, but instead of owning up, he burst into tears and said, "You just don't understand the pressure I'm under." The team was silent, and our manager eventually let it slide, for the moment. 2 weeks later, he missed another deadline, and this time, the manager was prepared. She showed him a printout of his tasks compared to the rest of the team and asked, "What pressure exactly?" He didn't have an answer. Edit. He quit a month later, saying he deserved better support. The team threw an unofficial celebration. Story 23. I had a friend in high school who was always in competition with everyone around her. If you got an A on a test, she got an even harder A. If you told a funny story, hers was always crazier. At first, it was annoying but harmless. That changed during senior year, when I landed the lead role in the school play. She auditioned too, but didn't get cast. Instead of being happy for me, she started spreading rumors that I only got the role because the drama teacher felt sorry for me. Things escalated when she claimed I had sabotaged her audition by giving her bad advice. I didn't even talk to her before auditions. It got so bad that I had to confront her. She broke down crying, saying she felt left out and that I didn't understand what it's like to not be chosen. I told her, "It's not about being chosen. It's about how you handle it when you're not." We drifted apart after that, and honestly, I don't miss the constant drama. Story 24. My neighbor, let's call her Linda, always has a complaint about something. Her yard? The HOA is out to get me. Her car? The mechanic ripped me off. One time she even accused me of parking in her spot on the public street. The funniest incident happened when she knocked on my door, saying my dog had attacked her. My dog is a 10-pound terrier who was inside the house at the time. I asked her to clarify, and she claimed the dog lunged at her through the window. I tried to explain that wasn't possible, but she wouldn't listen. Instead, she threatened to report me to animal control. I calmly invited her to check my doorbell camera, which clearly showed her walking past without any incident. She didn't apologize, but mumbled something about feeling unsafe in the neighborhood. A week later, she started complaining about another neighbor's cat. Some people just need something to be upset about. Story 25. At my last job, I worked with a woman who always had a reason for not meeting expectations. Late for meetings? The traffic was horrible. Missed deadlines? My computer crashed. One day, she missed a major client call because she wasn't feeling well. We later found out she'd been shopping at a nearby mall during the meeting. When the manager confronted her, she doubled down, saying, "You don't know how hard it is to balance work and personal life." Things came to a head during a company retreat when she showed up 3 hours late, saying her car broke down. One of our co-workers noticed she had a selfie on social media from that morning, showing her at brunch with friends. The manager finally had enough and called her out during a team meeting, saying, "It's not about balancing work and life, it's about showing up." She quit shortly after, claiming the company didn't appreciate her struggles. Edit. Last I heard, she's working as a life coach now. I can't make this up. Story 26. In college, I had a classmate who always claimed to be misunderstood. If he bombed a test, it was because the professor hates me. Didn't finish a project? Group work never goes my way. One semester, we were paired for a presentation, and I immediately knew it was going to be a disaster. Every time I asked him to contribute, he'd say he was working on the slides. Spoiler, he wasn't. The night before the presentation, I realized he hadn't done anything. I stayed up all night finishing it myself. The next day, during the presentation, he stood there and took credit for my work, even adding, "I really pushed myself on this one." I was fuming. After class, I went to the professor, showed her my emails and the timestamps on the slides, and explained what happened. She called him in, and he had the audacity to say, "She's just trying to make me look bad because she's jealous of my ideas." The professor didn't buy it and gave him a 0 for the assignment. I got full credit, but he sulked for weeks, telling everyone I was a control freak. Story 27. My coworker, let's call her Lisa, loved to stir the pot at work and then play the victim. One time, she spread a rumor that our manager was leaving for a new job. When it got back to the manager, Lisa immediately denied everything, claiming someone had twisted her words. The final straw came during a team meeting when she accused another coworker of stealing her idea. The coworker calmly pulled out a time-stamped email showing that she had proposed the idea weeks earlier. Lisa turned bright red and mumbled something about miscommunication. After the meeting, she started crying in the break room, saying she felt targeted. The manager eventually called her in and told her she needed to focus on her work instead of creating drama. Edit. A few weeks later, she filed a complaint with HR, claiming the team was bullying her. HR reviewed the situation and sided with the team. Lisa quit shortly after, but not before, leaving a cryptic goodbye email about how we'd miss her brilliance. Story 28. My neighbor, who we'll call Greg, is always complaining about something. His grass isn't as green as everyone else's. The city isn't maintaining the water pressure properly. His fence fell down during a storm. My insurance company is out to get me. The most ridiculous incident happened when he accused me of stealing his trash bin. He knocked on my door, furious, saying, "I know you took it because yours looks newer." I explained that mine was newer because the city had replaced it after the last storm. He didn't believe me and insisted on calling the city to confirm. When the city worker verified my story, Greg didn't apologize. Instead, he muttered, "Well, Maybe they gave you mine by mistake. A week later, his trash bin mysteriously showed up in his driveway. Turns out it had been blown into a ditch down the street. He still didn't apologize, but he did stop accusing me of random things, at least for now. Story 29. I had a friend in high school who was a total drama queen. Every little inconvenience in her life was a betrayal. Didn't text her back fast enough? You're ignoring me. Hung out with another friend? I guess I'm not important to you anymore. The peak of her antics came during our senior prom. She didn't get voted prom queen and spent the entire night crying in the bathroom. She accused everyone of sabotaging her because they were jealous of her confidence. The next day, she posted a long rant on social media about how the school was rigged against her and how she was the real winner. Most people just ignored it, but someone pointed out in the comments that she only got 3 votes, one of which was her own. After that, she went quiet for a while, but later resurfaced with a new friend group. Last I heard, she's still trying to prove her worth to people who aren't paying attention. Story 30. At my first job, there was this guy who was a master of deflection. Every time something went wrong, he'd find a way to blame someone else. Missed a deadline? The client didn't send the files in time. Incorrect data? The team didn't verify it properly. One day, he messed up a huge client order, costing the company thousands. Instead of owning up to it, he claimed that our software glitched and that IT was to blame. IT quickly proved there was no glitch, but he doubled down, saying they must have missed something. Our manager decided to review his work history and found a pattern of similar mistakes. When confronted, he started tearing up, saying, "I've been under so much pressure lately." The manager wasn't having it and told him he needed to improve immediately. Edit. A month later, he made another big mistake and tried to blame it on poor communication from the team. This time, the manager let him go. He posted on LinkedIn about being let go from a toxic workplace and how he was excited to start a new chapter. Classic. Story 31. In my old neighborhood, there was a guy who acted like he was the victim of every possible scenario. If his car got a parking ticket, it was because the city has it out for me. If his internet went down, it was the provider targeting him specifically. The worst incident happened when a new family moved in next door. Their kids accidentally kicked a soccer ball into his yard, and instead of handing it back, he came to their door yelling about property invasion. The parents apologized, but he demanded they teach their kids to respect boundaries. A week later, the family had a barbecue, and he called the police, claiming they were being too loud. The officers showed up, listened for a minute, and said it was within noise limits. He stormed back inside, furious. The kicker? That same week he hosted his own party with music so loud it rattled my windows. The family didn't complain, but I did. And when the cops arrived, he tried to argue that his noise was different, because it was a celebration. The officer wasn't amused and gave him a ticket. Story 32. At my previous job, there was a coworker who always seemed to be surrounded by drama. She'd come into work every day with a new story about how someone had wronged her. A rude barista, a mean cashier, or a neighbor who stole her parking spot. One time, she accused another coworker of taking her lunch from the fridge. She made a huge scene, calling them disrespectful and saying they ruined her day. The accused coworker, visibly confused, pointed out that her lunch was still in the fridge. Turns out, she hadn't even checked before making the accusation. She didn't apologize, of course. Instead, she said, "Well, it felt like something you'd do." After that, no one really trusted her. Edit. She eventually quit, claiming she couldn't work in a place so full of negativity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Story 33. My cousin loves to stir up drama and then pretend she's the victim. At family gatherings, she'll always find a way to start an argument and then act like everyone else is attacking her. Last Thanksgiving, she started a huge fight over the seating arrangement, saying it was unfair that she wasn't at the head of the table. When we reminded her that spot was for Grandma, she burst into tears, saying, "No one ever considers my feelings." Later, she complained that the pie I brought was store-bought and accused me of not caring about family traditions. I calmly told her I'd been working overtime and didn't have time to bake, but she just rolled her eyes and muttered, "Excuses, as usual." The next day, she posted on Facebook about how hard it is to be part of a family where no one respects you. The comments were full of sympathy from her friends, but the rest of us just laughed. Story 34. I once had a friend who thrived on being the center of attention, especially when it came to her struggles. If someone else talked about their problems, she'd immediately one-up them. Got a cold? She had the flu. Stressful day at work? Her boss was literally abusive. The breaking point came when another friend in our group announced she was getting married. Instead of being happy, she immediately started talking about how she had always dreamed of a big wedding, but couldn't afford it. At the engagement party, she spent the entire time crying about her own life instead of celebrating the bride-to-be. A few months later, when she wasn't invited to the bachelorette party, she went on a rant about how she was being excluded because everyone was jealous of her. In reality, the bride just wanted a drama-free weekend. After the wedding, she stopped talking to most of us, saying we weren't real friends. Honestly, it was a relief. Story 35. At my last job, there was a guy who could never admit when he made a mistake. One time, he sent the wrong file to a client, and instead of owning up to it, he blamed the intern, saying they had organized the folders wrong. The intern hadn't even touched the files. When the manager looked into it, she found that he had sent the email without checking the attachments. He immediately went into defense mode, saying, "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under." A week later, he missed another deadline and blamed the unrealistic expectations of the team. This time, the manager decided enough was enough and gave him a formal warning. He acted shocked, saying he felt targeted and that no one appreciated his hard work. Edit. He ended up leaving the company a month later, claiming he needed a more supportive environment. Last I heard, he's working somewhere new, and probably still blaming everyone else for his problems. Story 36. There was this guy in my office who always had a reason why things weren't his fault. Every time he made a mistake, it was because the system is flawed, or someone didn't give me clear instructions. It was exhausting. One time, he accidentally sent a sensitive email to the wrong client, which could have caused serious damage to the company. When confronted, he said, "Well, I wouldn't have sent it if I wasn't so overwhelmed with work." The thing is, he wasn't overwhelmed. He spent most of his time chatting by the coffee machine or scrolling on his phone. The breaking point came when our manager asked everyone to review a major report before it went out. He skimmed through it, missed several critical errors, and then blamed the rest of the team for not catching them either. Our manager wasn't having it and told him, "Accountability is part of your job." A month later, he quit, claiming he needed a job where people are more supportive. We didn't miss him. Story 37. My neighbor, let's call her Janet, was infamous for blaming everyone else for her problems. Her grass was dying. The HOA is discriminating against me. Her packages went missing. The delivery company hates me. One day, she knocked on my door and accused me of blocking her driveway with my car. The funny thing, I don't even own a car. I bike everywhere. I told her this, but she didn't believe me and said, "Maybe you borrowed someone else's car to spite me." A week later, she started leaving nasty notes on other neighbors' doors, accusing them of sabotaging her garden. Turns out, her sprinkler system was broken, and she hadn't noticed. When someone pointed it out, she didn't apologize. Instead, she said, "Well, maybe someone broke it on purpose." Eat it. She moved out a few months later, saying the neighborhood was toxic. Honestly, it's been peaceful ever since. Story 38. I used to work with a woman who constantly made excuses for her lack of productivity. If she didn't finish a task, it was because she was too busy helping others. If she was late, it was because traffic was insane. One day, she forgot to update a client's account, and the client complained. Instead of admitting her mistake, she blamed me, saying I didn't remind her in time. I was furious. I wasn't even on that project. When the manager asked her about it, she doubled down, saying I had distracted her with unnecessary questions. Thankfully, the manager checked the logs and saw that I hadn't even interacted with her that day. She was written up for lying, and after that, she avoided me like the plague. Story 39. In high school, there was a girl in my class who was always playing the victim. If she didn't make the cheerleading team, it was because the coach is biased. If she failed the test, it was because the teacher hates me. The most ridiculous incident happened during a group project. She didn't contribute at all, but when we got an average grade, she went to the teacher and complained that we had excluded her from the work. The teacher asked for proof, and we all provided emails and texts showing that we'd invited her to every meeting. When confronted, she burst into tears and said, "You don't understand how hard my life is." The teacher wasn't moved and told her, "Everyone has challenges, but that doesn't excuse lying." She ended up getting a 0 on the project. Story 40. At my old job, there was a guy who thought the entire world was against him. If he got constructive feedback, it was because management doesn't like me. If he didn't get a raise, it was because the company is cheap. One day, he forgot to include a crucial attachment in an email to a client. When the client followed up, he blamed the IT department, saying the system must have glitched. IT quickly proved that he had never uploaded the attachment in the first place. The manager called him out in a team meeting, and instead of apologizing, he said, "Well, maybe if I wasn't given so many tasks, this wouldn't have happened." The manager replied, "Everyone here has the same workload, and they're managing just fine." Edit. He left the company a few weeks later, posting a dramatic LinkedIn update about how he was leaving a toxic environment to pursue new opportunities. None of us were surprised. Story 41. I used to live with a roommate who was the queen of avoiding responsibility. If the dishes weren't done, it was because she was too busy. If the rent was late, it was because her bank messed up. One time, I came home to find our sink overflowing with water because she had clogged it with food scraps. When I asked her what happened, she said, "I don't know, it just started doing that." I pointed out the chunks of pasta still sitting in the drain, and she said, "Well, it shouldn't clog that easily. That's the landlord's fault." I ended up fixing it myself, and she didn't even thank me. Instead, she complained about how stressful it was to always be blamed for everything. Needless to say, I found a new place to live pretty quickly after that. Story 42. At my last job, there was a guy who could never admit he made a mistake. Once, he completely botched a client order, and when the client complained, he blamed the admin assistant for not inputting the right details. The assistant showed proof that she had emailed him the exact details weeks before. When our manager confronted him, he said, "Well, maybe if I wasn't always cleaning up other people's messes, I'd have time to focus." The manager wasn't buying it and told him he needed to take responsibility for his actions. A month later, he missed another deadline and tried to blame the IT department for a slow computer. IT quickly proved there was nothing wrong. He ended up on a performance improvement plan, but instead of improving, he quit, saying the company was too demanding. Story 43. There's a woman in my neighborhood who loves to make everything about her. If someone gets a new car, she'll complain about how hers is on its last legs. If someone throws a party, she'll talk about how she wasn't invited, even if she was. The most ridiculous incident happened when our neighbor planted a new tree in their yard. She immediately went over and accused them of blocking her sunlight. The tree was nowhere near her property, but she kept insisting it would ruin her quality of life. A few days later, she put up a post in the neighborhood group claiming she was being bullied because no one was taking her concerns seriously. Most people ignored her, but one person replied with a screenshot of the local zoning laws proving the tree was perfectly legal. She didn't respond after that. Edit. She later cut down some bushes in her own yard and claimed she was improving the neighborhood's aesthetics. No one believed her. Story 44. In high school, I had a friend who was always competing with everyone. If you told her you got a B on a test, she'd say, "Well, I got an A, but it was way harder for me because I didn't even study." One time, I got a lead role in the school play, and she was furious. She spent weeks telling everyone that I only got the role because I was the teacher's favorite. During rehearsals, she'd loudly comment on how she could have done better if she'd been cast. On opening night, she sat in the front row and made a big show of clapping only for the other performers. Afterward, she told me, "You were okay, but I just don't think you fit the role." The funny part? A few weeks later, she auditioned for another play and didn't get in. She blamed the director, saying they didn't recognize real talent. Story 45. At my first job, I worked with someone who thought she was the hardest working person in the office. If anyone else got recognition, she'd claim they only succeeded because of luck or connections. One day, we had a group project, and she barely contributed. When the manager praised the team for a job well done, she immediately jumped in and said, "Well, I worked really hard to make sure everything came together." Everyone in the room exchanged awkward glances, but no one said anything. The next week, she messed up a report and tried to blame it on someone else. When the manager pointed out her name on the file, she said, "Oh, that must have been an accident." After a few more incidents like that, the manager started keeping a closer eye on her work. Edit. She eventually left the company, saying she was moving on to bigger and better things. A few months later, I heard she was fired from her new job for the same behavior. Some people never change. Story 46. I once had a co-worker who thrived on drama. If something went wrong, you could bet she'd find a way to twist it into a sob story about how she was the victim. Missed a deadline? No one ever supports me. Got negative feedback? The manager has it out for me. One time, she completely messed up a client presentation by using the wrong data. Instead of owning up to it, she claimed the intern had given her bad information. The intern was devastated until the manager checked the records and found that the intern's work had been perfectly accurate. When confronted, my coworker started crying, saying, "I'm just under so much pressure right now." The manager told her, "We're all under pressure. That's not an excuse to lie." She quieted down for a while after that, but it wasn't long before she found another excuse to stir the pot. Story 47. My old neighbor had a habit of making everything about her. If you mentioned a minor inconvenience, she'd immediately interrupt with a dramatic story about how her life was worse. Got stuck in traffic? "Oh, you think that's bad? I had to wait 3 hours for roadside assistance last week." One day, a storm knocked out power in our neighborhood. Everyone else handled it fine, but she showed up at my door, crying about how she couldn't survive without Wi-Fi. She begged to use my generator, even though I needed it for my fridge. When I said no, she stormed off, muttering about how no one in this neighborhood cares about anyone but themselves. Later, she started a rumor that I had refused to help her in a life-threatening situation. When the power came back on, I confronted her, and she just said, "Well, maybe you should think about being more neighborly next time." I stopped talking to her after that. Story 48. In college, I had a classmate who always acted like the professor was picking on her. Every time she got a bad grade, she'd say, "He just doesn't like me because I speak my mind." During one group project, she refused to do any work, saying she was too busy with other classes. When we finished the project without her, she complained to the professor that we had excluded her. The professor asked her what her contributions were, and she stammered, "I was going to help, but they didn't ask me to." He asked us for our side, and we showed him all the texts and emails where we'd tried to involve her. She got a 0 for the project and spent the rest of the semester glaring at us in class. Edit. She later told anyone who would listen that the professor had sabotaged her academic career. None of us believed her. Story 49. At my last job, there was a guy who always played the victim. If a meeting didn't go well, it was because the team didn't back me up. If he missed the deadline, it was because the client kept changing their mind. One day, he sent an incomplete report to a major client. When the client pointed out the missing sections, he blamed the admin team for not organizing his files properly. The manager wasn't buying it and told him to fix it immediately. Instead of apologizing, he said, "I'm just so overwhelmed right now. I need more support." The manager replied, "Support isn't the issue. Accountability is." After that, he became quieter in meetings, but didn't improve much. A few months later, he left the company, claiming he was burned out from carrying the team. We all had a good laugh about that. Story 50. I had a friend who constantly made herself the center of attention. If you talked about a promotion, she'd say, "Must be nice. I'm stuck in a dead-end job." If you mentioned a vacation, she'd sigh and say, "I wish I could afford to travel, but I have too many responsibilities." The final straw came when another friend announced she was pregnant. Instead of being happy, this friend said, "Well, I wanted to start a family first, but I guess that's not happening now." Everyone was shocked at how selfish she sounded, but she didn't seem to notice. At the baby shower, she spent the entire time complaining about how hard her life was. Eventually, someone asked her to stop making everything about herself. She stormed out saying, "No one here understands what I'm going through." Edit. A few months later, she reached out, saying she wanted to make amends. We tried, but she quickly fell back into her old habits. Some people just never change. Story 51. I once worked with a woman who was the queen of excuses. If she didn't complete a task, it was because someone didn't explain it clearly. If a client wasn't happy, it was because they didn't know what they wanted. The tipping point came during a major project when she claimed she couldn't contribute because her computer wasn't working. IT checked it out and found nothing wrong. When confronted, she said, "It was working fine yesterday, but now it's just acting up randomly." She spent the entire meeting talking about how unfair it was to expect her to work with unreliable equipment. The manager, fed up, gave her a laptop and told her there were no more excuses. She didn't last much longer after that. Apparently, accountability wasn't her strong suit. Story 52. My neighbor loves to play the victim. If her garden doesn't thrive, it's because someone must have sabotaged it. If her dog barks too much and people complain, it's because no one appreciates animals anymore. One evening, she knocked on my door, accusing me of stealing her mail. I was stunned. It made no sense. When I pointed out the mailbox was still locked, she said, "Well, maybe you have a spare key or something." A few days later, she found her missing mail under a stack of papers on her own desk. Instead of apologizing, she left me a note saying, "This wouldn't have happened if the postal service were more reliable." I decided it wasn't worth engaging anymore. Story 53. In college, I had a professor who was notorious for playing favorites. One student in particular could do no wrong. She always got the highest grades, even when her work was mediocre at best. During one assignment, she completely missed the deadline, but still received full credit. The rest of us were furious and brought it up with the professor. He claimed she had extenuating circumstances, but wouldn't elaborate. The next week, she showed up late to class with a coffee in hand and joked about oversleeping after a long night out. It was clear she hadn't faced any challenges. She was just taking advantage of the professor's bias. Edit. At the end of the semester, the department head reviewed grading inconsistencies, and she didn't come out looking great. She had to redo several assignments to avoid a failing grade. Karma finally caught up. Story 54. At my old job, there was a guy who never seemed to do any actual work, but was always the first to complain about how overworked he was. He'd spend hours chatting in the break room and then panic when deadlines approached. One day, he completely missed a deliverable and tried to blame the rest of the team for not reminding him. The manager asked, "How many reminders do you need to check your own calendar?" He stammered something about being overwhelmed by other projects, but everyone knew he didn't have much on his plate. The manager assigned his tasks to someone else, and everything ran smoothly after that. He eventually quit, saying he needed a less toxic environment. No one was sad to see him go. Story 55. I had a friend who always made herself the center of every conversation. If you shared good news, she'd find a way to turn it into a pity party for herself. Got a promotion? She'd say, "I'll never get ahead in life." Going on vacation? She'd sigh and say, "Must be nice to have the money for that." The last straw was at a mutual friend's engagement party. Instead of celebrating, she spent the whole night complaining about how she'd never find love, because guys don't appreciate real women anymore. By the end of the evening, she had everyone rolling their eyes. A few weeks later, she called me, upset that she hadn't been invited to the bachelorette party. I told her it was because the bride wanted to avoid drama. She hung up on me and posted a vague rant on social media about fake friends. We haven't talked since, and honestly, my life is so much quieter now. Story 56. I had a coworker who loved to complain about how unfair life was. If he didn't get a promotion, it was because the manager plays favorites. If his ideas were rejected in meetings, it was because no one understands real innovation. One time, he missed an important client call, claiming his calendar didn't notify him. The manager checked and found the call had been scheduled for weeks, with multiple reminders sent out. When confronted, he said, "Well, I've just been so overwhelmed lately." Later, he tried to shift the blame onto another coworker, saying they should have reminded him personally. The manager didn't buy it and told him, "Your schedule is your responsibility." He sulked for the rest of the week, telling everyone how toxic the work environment was. Story 57. My neighbor is the type of person who thinks every small inconvenience is a personal attack. If her delivery is late, it's because the driver hates her. If her lawn doesn't look as good as everyone else's, it's because the HOA is against her. One day, she accused me of stealing her recycling bin. I hadn't even noticed it was missing. I told her I hadn't touched it, but she insisted I must have moved it by mistake. A few hours later, she found it on the other side of her driveway, where she'd left it after trash day. Instead of apologizing, she said, "Well, maybe if people in this neighborhood were more considerate, this wouldn't happen." I've avoided talking to her ever since. Story 58. In college, there was a girl in my dorm who always found a way to be the victim. If someone didn't invite her to a party, she'd claim it was because they were jealous of her. If she got a bad grade, it was because the professor had it out for her. One time, she borrowed my notes for a class and then accused me of giving her the wrong information when she failed the quiz. I showed her my quiz score. It was nearly perfect, but she still insisted I had sabotaged her. When word got around, people stopped helping her. She complained that no one was willing to give her a chance, but really, no one wanted to deal with her drama anymore. Edit. Years later, I saw her on social media posting about how she's finally free from toxic people. Some things never change. Story 59. At my last job, there was a guy who acted like he was the hardest working person in the room, even though everyone knew he wasn't. He'd spend hours talking about how busy he was, but never actually got anything done. One time, he was supposed to deliver a report to a client, but completely forgot. When the client followed up, he blamed the admin team for not prioritizing his tasks. The manager reviewed the situation and found out he hadn't even started the report. When confronted, he claimed he was spread too thin and needed more support. The manager replied, "You'd have more time if you spent less of it talking about how busy you are." He quit shortly after, saying he needed a job where he was appreciated. Story 60. My cousin is the definition of a drama queen. Every family event turns into an opportunity for her to complain about how hard her life is. If someone else shares good news, she'll immediately one-up them with a story about her struggles. At a recent family reunion, my aunt announced she was retiring early. Everyone was happy for her, except my cousin, who immediately started crying about how she'd never be able to retire because of her financial burdens. She made the whole dinner awkward with her constant interruptions and sighing. The next day, she posted on Facebook about how no one in the family supports her dreams. When I asked her why she felt that way, she said, "It's obvious. No one listens to me." Edit. She stopped coming to family events after that, saying they were too stressful. Honestly, the gatherings have been much more enjoyable without her.